Okay, so let's first define Islamization. As you see here, Islamization is a process that involves political, cultural, social processes in terms of representing or constructing Muslim identity in both public and private domains. So today we're going to look at the public domain, but of course it's not just public domain that we're looking at. It also involves Islamization as a term, involves constructing and acting out, practicing Muslim identity within the home as well. Now, although the context I'm talking about here in terms of public space involves Muslims, it also involves a very important interaction with the secular state. And particularly in today's talk about mosque building, the role of planners, local government officials, the whole apparatus of the state, both at local level and at central government level. And what's interesting, I've just been recently, as Tom was mentioning, I'm working on, going back to my work on pilgrimage, and I was very interested in an article that talked about the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the way that they approached religious communities. And they tended to construct leaderships in terms of dealing with local populations. So in a sense, Muslim communities were created out of the colonial imperial project. And as Tom was mentioning, my first research was done in Calcutta in the 1970s, actually. If you look at the history of the British Empire in India, you realize that, particularly during the 1920s and 30s, the British colonial government wanted to deal with the whole issue of nationalism, partly in terms of constructing or dealing with religious leaders. And then the issue is, of course, who is a religious leader? What claim do they have to represent anyone? So this process isn't therefore just within, among Muslims, it involves this interface with the secular state. So it has a history. So what we're looking at today is more contemporary issues, but I want to point to the longer history. We mustn't see this as simply a recent phenomenon. Thanks. Now, in terms of the recent process, a lot of people have been talking about this very important decline of the secular welfare state, leading to debates around post-secular society. After the Second World War, the secular state largely came forward as, if you like, the provider of care from cradle to grave. This is a very important phrase, really. And in a sense, what the National Health Service and other elements of the nation state did was to some extent, replace religious and other philanthropic groups. It tried to provide a comprehensive service to all, regardless of religion, race, gender, etc. Now, what we've seen, of course, in the last 30 years is the cost of this cradle-to-grave provision the government no longer wishes to pay for, and not just in Britain, but across Europe and North America. So the secular state has been in the process of the last 30 years of trying to bring in community groups, and clearly religious community groups have been one key player, not just them, but religious community groups have been invited to fill the space that the secular state is no longer wishing to pay for and get involved in. So the welfare state is still around, but it's in a process of franchising and co-opting civil society, if you like, civil society groups to cover the areas that the welfare state is no longer prepared to do. So in terms of wider debates about the so-called post-secular society, secularization theory in its kind of crude form, tended to present the modern nation state as replacing traditional providers of care, such as religious groups. So the whole idea was that with increasing modernization, you had a process of increasing secularization, where if religion was still around, it was largely relegated to the private sphere. What we've seen in the last 30 years is that that hasn't happened. But in fact, the secular state has actually encouraged religious groups to make a key involvement in the public sphere. So rather than privatizing, we've seen, if like, a resurgence in a way of religious issues in the public sphere. And as I say, this has, if you like, this is part of a longer process. So we have, if you like, it's not a kind of unilinear process. We tend to think of things as going in a kind of straight line. In fact, what we got is a kind of rather curvy wave, or in and out. So that's why I think it's important to think of these contemporary modes and to what extent are they replaying pre-Second World War processes? To what extent are they involved in, if you like, colonial traces in a post-colonial world? And of course, as we know, although mosques are very important places like churches, temples of religious worship, they can also be places of control of congregations by ministers, by religious leaders. They can also be, as we know, in debates around certain mosques, one of which I'm going to refer to today. They can be places where, of course, debates about terrorism, they can be places of surveillance. As we know, the PREVENT program has been quite controversial because people have criticized PREVENT for encouraging religious leaders to work with government in order to control and act as agents of surveillance for their own congregations. Mosques can also be places of resistance, so they're not just one thing, there are multiple in their character, and that's, again, I think why it's so interesting to talk about this topic. But of course, although I've emphasized the historical traces, clearly some things are new. Often historians say, well, it's just the same old thing, this all went on in the 19th century, so what's new about this? Well, clearly what's new is that a lot of these struggles and contestations over urban space and identity are very much now globalized. Translocal, people have talked about transnationalism, but also people talk about translocalism, that is, a village in, say, the Middle East or a village in Bangladesh will be networked with relatives living in, say, Tower Hamlets. That's not at a national level, that's at a very local level. And the power of communications, mobile phones, internet, etc., enable people to be aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. And so therefore, a local dispute is never totally local. It cannot be now local in this highly globally mediatized world. The next point I want to make, of course, is that the whole issue of disputes often are crystallized in grand projects. Again, this isn't peculiar to Britain. It's not peculiar to Islam. It's a global phenomenon. So right across the world, groups are engaged in large building projects. Money is going, a lot of money going into these projects. So clearly, if you're a Buddhist, if you're a Hindu, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Christian, you'll be part of this making a statement. So it's both a material statement, we are here, and this is our building, look at us, but it's also, of course, immaterial. It's about belief systems, it's about cultural processes. And of course, these two are connected. And of course, they are clearly acted out at local levels, even if they are globalized. Roland Robson coined the phrase glocalization. It's rather, I think perhaps a vulgar term, but what he's trying to show is the way that global and local are intertwined. Anyway, clearly at a local level, as we'll see, people are involved, a variety of actors, if you like, social actors are involved, politicians, crucially, local officials, different Muslim groups, non-Muslim activists. They're all part of this complex contestation of the space that public buildings like mosques, temples, gurudwaras, etc. Invite. So just to go back to the whole issue of privatization, to some extent, of the welfare state, the post-secular society debate, clearly the state is still a key player, but what it does is to work with a variety of other agents in civil society, private sector, community organizations, interfaith organizations, building moderate elites. Muslim Council of Britain can be seen as very much, to some extent, a product of the secular state encouraging a certain kind of leadership to emerge with which it could do deals, as opposed to the Muslim Parliament, which you may remember the government was very hostile to, partly because of its links with Iran, etc. Clearly involves planning controls. And as I said, of course, it can also involve direct and indirect forms of surveillance. Okay, so that's the general background, and let's get down to specifics. And because most of my work's been done in London, I'm going to focus on London. We'll think about a bit later on to what extent is London particular, because I also worked with many other people on debates around global cities, and clearly London is not the same as Cardiff. Cardiff is a capital, and so is London. But London is also competing with New York and Frankfurt and Tokyo, etc., for footloose global capital, and being very successful at it until 2008, when the whole thing crashed in a nasty heap, although it's, of course, coming back up again. So clearly, London, with 8 million people now, is a very important hotspot, if you like, for what we're talking about. And as we well know, of course, global migration has reshaped the character of London. And as you can see, in the 70s and 80s, people talked about inner cities. And to some extent, that has changed. A very important issue is, if you like, the suburban movement out of the earlier inner city cores. So if you look at this map, this is Heathrow over here. So this would be a very strong Punjabi, Hindu, Sikh core. Over here is Tower Hamlets, very strong Bangladeshi, and Newham, and Malvern Forest up here, Bangladeshi, Pakistani. Down here in Tooting, anyone knows Tooting High Street, an amazing place. So you get these strong points of original settlement, but things have moved on. And people have written in Glasgow and Birmingham and elsewhere about the movement out of these original inner city cores into the suburban areas. So London suburbs are clearly quite white over here, southeast London and northeast London, still quite white, but over here, of course, not. So you can't just make a kind of division between inner city ethnic minorities and outer London white suburbs. It isn't working that way, even though they're clearly down here in Kingston, Roehampton, we're clearly very strong white middle class, but other areas over here, not so. And as I said here, clearly this affects Muslims as well, so this shows you to some extent that overlaps quite nicely with the previous map. But as you see, the lighter shades show that Muslims are also represented in the further suburbs, certainly in West London, and to some extent in North London and South London. So it's a dynamic picture, which of course raises the issue then of building new mosques to represent this mobile population. So London's mobility, of course, encourages placemaking and trying to find space for the newcomers. Okay, so examples. This is an iconic building. I'm sure many people here will know of it. It was, just for those who don't, this is the Brick Lane Jamme Masjid, Brick Lane Mosque. Started life in the 1740s as a Huguenot chapel, Calvinist Protestant chapel. The Huguenots moved on, and in the late 19th century, it became a Jewish synagogue, servicing quite a conservative Jewish synagogue and school, serving the local Jewish community that had moved in the 1880s, 1890s. In the 1970s, it became a mosque, became what it is now. I was fascinated by this. When is a mosque a mosque? Because, as you know, mosques are very different around the world. If you go to West Africa, they don't look like mosques in the Middle East. We tend to think very often, people who are not Muslim, that mosque must have a cupola and a minaret. Anyway, this is a very interesting building because it was under planning regulations. It couldn't be knocked down. It was in a conservation area. So how do you Islamize this building? And so what recently has been done, they put up this thing here, which is not meant to be a minaret, although it looks like a minaret. It's got the crescent at the top. So it's an attempt to get around planning regulations, to kind of classic British kind of fudge, really, pragmatic. We still want it to stay preserved as a very important statement of urban heritage going back to the 18th century, but we also want it to reflect contemporary use as a mosque. And so, as I say, this is a very recent attempt to try and make a statement. Next one. Now, this is more like what we tend to think of. This is East London Mosque, not very far away, about a 10-minute walk from Brick Lane Mosque, with a massive new development, London Muslim Centre, which is largely a housing development. And this was the first purpose-built mosque in East London. Quite controversial because of various people accusing it of being involved in various jihadist activities. Local MP controversially got involved in a big spat over it. It's very highly networked. It works very closely with local council. Brick Lane Mosque is often seen as a community mosque in the sense that it largely is quite internal. It doesn't really want to get engaged in local politics, in local community affairs. The East London Mosque has gone the other way. It's very much involved, very active. And also it has a funeral parlour, because one of the big issues in the 80s was, of course, were Muslims going to go back to the villages they come from in coffins, or were they to be buried here? And to have a burial ground is a major statement of settlement, that we are here and our loved ones can be buried in English soil, British soil. So the East London Mosque is a multi-purpose, purpose-built mosque, providing all kinds of services. It has a bookstore and shops, etc. And as I say, quite a lot of Bangladeshi local politics have revolved around this mosque. Got involved in the whole war crimes debate that some of you may know of, because of various individuals associated with the management committee. So unlike the Brick Lane Mosque, a new purpose-built, highly politicized mosque in a whole number of ways. Next one. Now, where's this? It's Docklands, of course. I just want to say, when the East London Mosque was built in the 1980s, there was quite a controversy. There was controversy over the Brick Lane Mosque in terms of the internal refurbishment. A lot of the old furniture was taken out. A lot of people were very upset about that and criticised the management committee. The East London Mosque, the large focus was really around the call to prayer, the azan, because the mosque was allowed to have this right, and a lot of, again, non-Muslims, again, kind of focused on this as an issue, saying, well, you know, we don't want to hear this kind of sound in our city, etc. Now, this is further out in Newham, and this is the Abbey Mills site. Some of you may know that this is this was bought by the Tabligh Jamaat in the 1990s, And it's an industrial, a highly polluted industrial estate that no one really wanted. The Tabligh Jamaat had a place in Tower Hamlets, but they wanted to have more space. So they built this, and then they applied for planning permission to build a big centre. And this became highly controversial, partly because where it is overlooks the city of sin, capitalism. It's a very strategic site, and it was right next to the Olympic site. So the local council had a real problem. They wanted, to some extent, to respond to the Tabligh Jamaat's desire to develop their site, but at the same time, they are under great pressure from a variety of constituencies, not just people from outside Muslim community, but those within. Quite a lot of Muslims who joined a petition against the Tabligh Jamaat. They didn't want Tabligh Jamaat to make this happen. And so it's been mired in controversy. In fact, before I was coming here, I just wanted to check on what the current situation is, and it's still going on. This long debate is still going on, and I think they've gone now to it's almost the last stage now of trying to get it through. And it went to the Secretary of State, et cetera, et cetera. So an incredibly complicated struggle. Please. And this was one design produced by a very talented architect who works with the Migration Research Unit, actually. And as you see, what the designer tried to do was to produce something that didn't look like a mosque, i.e. didn't look what people's views of a mosque would be. It's a kind of postmodern mosque, if you like. But immediately, the debate came around size and numbers. And people claiming that, well, we're going to have all these Muslims coming here, 20,000, 30,000, the numbers got... So the whole numbers issue came up, linked to traffic, whole variety of issues that seem to be secular, but also to some extent masking the fear that this would be a project that was just too grand for the locality. So the whole issue comes around, what does a building look like that fits a locality? Can we have such a mega, it came up called the mega mosque. So the whole politics of the language is very important. And in the debates, people are saying, well, this is going to be even far bigger than, say, St. Paul's or Liverpool Cathedral. You know, the people coming here are going to be 4 times as many as any, the largest Anglican cathedral. So all kinds of notions of appropriate size, of nationality, of course. You know, in a sense, how dare these people build something that's even greater than our largest cathedral. So a fascinating mix of planning debates, quantitative, highly secular debates, linked up with more complicated cultural aspects of identity, linked to a notion of locality. Just to remind ourselves, not very far from here, there's a very beautiful, well, I think it's beautiful, some people might not think so, but anyway, this is, I just put this in here because clearly Hindus, mosques tend to hit lots of buttons, whereas Hindu temples, planning for them tends to be not so difficult to get, partly because they can present themselves, well, we're not like those Muslims, i.e. we're not terrorists like that lot. So to some extent, planning resistance to temple building has not been so vigorous as it has in the same locality as the case of building the Abbey Mosque. And interesting enough, to the right, there's the pub where they started, and they still use the pub for various rituals, but they built this amazing statement in the back streets of Newham, not, as I say, not so far away. So things can happen. A lot depends on how you play the game. And I think also the Tabligh Jamaat were not very sophisticated in their political involvement. They're a very closed community. they eventually got in a firm of a PR firm to help them because their public image and the handling of the controversy was so limited. I must speed up. I'm aware of the time. Yeah, thank you. Right, now I wanted to you could spend all your life writing about East End, but it's important to think more broadly. And in the 1990s, I got fascinated by comparing what was happening in East End with this group of Dawoodi Bohras, a Shia group, strong, highly globalized trading group, origins in Yemen, Egypt, but very strongly represented in Gujarat. And again, they wanted to build a purpose-built site, and they were originally in Fulham, where I was living actually, and then they had a community centre, former Jewish community centre in Southall, and then they were able to, and there was local protests, so the local council helped them build this site. Again, similar kinds of arguments of inappropriate size, issues. It was on an industrial estate, so people were worried that this would discourage businesses from coming here. Eventually, in this case, the local council very much supported the Dawoodi Bohras, and they were able to build the site, not without some struggle. What's interesting about these debates is that people get very worked up at the time. Once they're built, people tend to get on with it. Well, it's there now. And so, again, I was preparing the talk, and I was going back to the debates at the time, and they were very intense. And now it's hard to remember, why do people get so worked up about this? And here we have, so a lot depends on how you build your alliances with the local elites. And here, of course, Charles representing the national elite. And of course, the leader of the Dawoodi Bohras is seen as a spiritual and a secular leader, just like the Ismailis, for example. So he's seen as royalty. So this is royalty meeting other royalty. Interesting enough, in that dispute around the Dawoodi Bohra mosque, the local residents who are not Muslims said, well, we don't want Southall here. That was quite a racist statement, actually. And they presented this local church as epitomizing national identity, and often in quite conservative notions of national identity, the village and the village church is trotted out as the epitome of what is typical of English heritage. Interesting enough, the vicar of this church said, well, I don't want to be co-opted by these people trying to use my church as a symbol in resistance to the mosque. So but we'll see now the next one. As you see, it's next to the Grand Union Canal, so there's an industrial heritage here. It looks very scenic now, but at the time in the 19th century, it's very much a working canal. Next one. And as you see, it has a typical kind of suburban street life. It's not the most beautiful area of London. So the kind of the village church contrasts with the kind of rather mundane character of the suburban landscape. This one. And a colleague of mine, Bindi Shah, has done a very nice paper, again, exploring how the Jains, a very small community, again from Gujarat, have been very good at playing the game. Often this comes back to being able to play the game that are set by the establishment. And this is, again, not so far from the Dawoodi Bohra mosque, but they didn't run into the kind of opposition that the Dawoodis did, partly because they were very good at playing the game, and partly because they weren't Muslims. Next one. And as you see here, again, the Archbishop of Canterbury invited to come along and pose. And in fact, that day he also visited the Northolt Mosque. So it was a kind of nice statement. But again, this whole point about how important it is to forge these alliances. Let's move on. And the last example I want to mention is as Tom was saying, I'm very interested in pilgrimage, and a Dutch scholar called Amma Margahi at Leiden has been studying kind of the first British pilgrimage or English pilgrimage site, which is a shrine dedicated to Abdul Wahab Siddiqui, or Hazrat Sahib, as he is known, who led a group that was trying to resist Saudi Wahhabism and represented the kind of Sufi Islam that, if anyone knows South Asian history, is a very, very strong tradition, very much different from the Saudi Wahhab Islam that a lot of Islamists tend to be fascinated by. Next one. As I say, here is a self-employed imam in Coventry, one of the founders of the World Islamic Mission. Charisma, he was seen as charismatic, partly because of the educational initiatives he's involved in, but also this strong tradition of peer. He was seen as a holy spiritual guide who could actually heal people. For me, it's very important because in Calcutta, I lived with a Bengali Muslim family who, again, were disciples of a peer. So this resonated very strongly with me. They have a very wide group of devotees from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Suriname, based in UK, but also based in the Netherlands. So again, they reflect this kind of transnational network that I talked about at the beginning. That's the reference if anyone's interested. Next one. The usual problem, where do you find a premise? So this place was a former mental hospital, so they're able to kind of buy it, 19th century building, but in the grounds they built, the next slide, this. And you could be in Punjab, perhaps. So a very nice bringing together. This is the tomb of Hazrat Sahib. And next one. And here are devotees celebrating his anniversary of his death. So we have this amazing bringing together, I suppose, of a 19th century history with contemporary Sufi group that are transnational and translocal. And here are the people having a great time in the gardens. Okay, so I think now we need to wrap up. Next one, please. Okay, so what I've tried to do here, therefore, is to try and give you some flavor of the complexity that Islamization involves. And the importance of religious placemaking, that people want to make a statement about place, that we are here and we want to express our identity in this place. And that inevitably involves all kinds of complex ethnic and racial dynamics, largely in contemporary British cities, but not just, it's not just an urban phenomenon, but it's largely an urban phenomenon. It involves a complex process of global migration, gentrification. Very often these areas are places that white middle-class people are competing for space with. There's another case that in Walthamstow I was involved in, where a local Pentecostal group were largely pushed out by urban art elite who wanted the cinema that they were using to be restored as a cinema. So gentrification, a very important driver in London, working class areas becoming gentrified. So competing interest groups. And although we talked about mosques, it involves also Christian churches as well. And in fact, in London, less than half of planning applications succeed for new buildings, temples, mosques, churches. So London has a particular problem of over-demand and not enough public space. But importantly, what we're seeing, I think, is the development of what you might call a religious market segmentation, where the kind of locally based parish model, which to some extent the local mosque tends to reproduce, is in competition or is in parallel with the so-called gathered community model. The gathered community model was developed in the 19th century by nonconformist churches that couldn't build churches everywhere. So they had to gather people from all over the place. Very different from the local parish model, which is embedded, if you like, in the Church of England, where the local church, you walk to your local church. The gathered community model is a much more mobile one, depends upon people having buses and transport, etc., and willing to move to a particular focal point. So I think certainly Brick Lane Mosque is a kind of almost like a parish church, whereas the East London Mosque is much more diverse. And of course, the Abbey Mills Mosque, if it ever got built, would again be very much the gathered community type of model where people were coming from all over London and beyond London. So what we're dealing here is, therefore, is the growing diversity of the Islamisation process linked to increasing mobility and diversity as people move out from the inner core areas. So the Abbey Mills, Dawidi Bora, Hazrat Sahib shrines are all examples, I think, of, if you like, the move, or to some extent, the parallel development of the gathered community model, where people come even from other countries, not just from across the region. So here we have, if you like, networks that extend from local to transnational, translocal to even global. As we've seen, of course, state and national elites play a key role through planning regulations and alliances. So getting the Archbishop of Canterbury to come, getting Prince of Wales to come is an important statement. And so to some extent, we could talk about, if you like, Anglicisation. To what extent is this a kind of process of assimilation, if you like, a certain kind of English way of doing things, a kind of pragmatic adaptation, like the Brick Lane Mosque putting what is not supposed to be a minaret in front of the mosque when it clearly is a minaret. So how do we kind of fudge the issues and muddle along? But of course, they also link to countries of origin, back to South Asia predominantly, not just Malaysia too. And of course, it deals with notions of the Ummah, the notion of a global Muslim community that inspires people today. So these kinds of buildings, they are exceptional in a way, but I think they are interesting because they reveal, if you like, translocal urban hotspots, where religion matters not just to members of that congregation, but to outsiders as well, who feel that important issues are at stake. And so therefore we live in a British society that isn't totally secularized. Religion still matters, religious symbolism still matters, and the Church of England are very much involved in this process. To some extent, they welcome this diversity because it keeps them in business, if you like. It shows that they are still a key player. As I said, London to some extent might be particular. How do we reproduce this? You know, are the struggles the same in Cardiff, Swansea, Birmingham, Glasgow, etc.? So Richard Gale's not here tonight, but he's done some excellent work in Birmingham particularly. We need more clinical research. We're just touching on issues. And it raises very interesting issues about landscape. What is the British landscape in a multicultural society? Is it just that kind of church in Northolt? It's not just the village church anymore. And interesting enough, as people move out into the suburbs is kind of suburbs, it's kind of country in the city kind of thing. The kind of dichotomy between urban and rural to some extent is kind of getting muddled, if you like, or fuzzy. And as we're in Wales, I just wanted to mention a very striking example of this, which is a temple in Scandervale in Wales. And if everyone knows that, it's an amazing, fascinating story. So it's not just in the city. Our countryside, too, is bound up in this process. Thanks very much.